Welcome back. In our last lesson, we talked about the Populist Party, which was formed to address a lot of the issues that farmers and laborers faced. The party pushed for several reforms, including government ownership of railroads and telegraphs, the direct election of U.S. senators, and free silver. William Jennings Bryan, a populist, won the Democratic nomination for president in 1896, but he was defeated by Republican William McKinley. Okay, we also briefly mentioned imperialism or international expansion in our last lesson. Understand, after the Mexican War, when Manifest Destiny dominated the scene, and then there was sectional conflict over slavery, which led to the Civil War, yeah, we got pretty preoccupied. We didn't really have much time for foreign affairs, even though France mounted a serious challenge to the Monroe Doctrine. Actually, it was France, Great Britain, and Spain. Britain and Spain eventually withdrew their troops when Mexico repaid the debts they owed. But France kept their troops there even after Mexico repaid them and established Maximilian I. France ignored American protests while the Civil War was raging. But when it was over and Johnson stationed 50,000 troops by the Rio Grande with an ultimatum, France withdrew quietly and the U.S. successfully upheld the Monroe Doctrine. And Maximilian was executed by a Mexican firing squad. Now, obviously, the U.S. was back on the foreign stage, no longer absorbed in their own issues. But things had changed over the years during U.S. preoccupation. European imperialism was on the rise, just not so much in the Western Hemisphere. So, in today's lesson, we're going to talk about how the new imperialist tendencies led to America's expansion in the Pacific. Some Americans wanted in on the colonial system or imperialism. We'll talk about why the U.S. began acquiring new territories and what new territories the U.S. gained. So, why did the U.S. begin acquiring new territories? After the U.S. had successfully upheld the Monroe Doctrine with France, the U.S. turned its attention to Britain. Even though Britain did cooperate in leaving Mexico, there were still three long standing differences or conflicts that needed to be addressed. First, the U.S. felt that Great Britain needed to compensate them for the damages its merchant fleet had suffered during the Civil War from commerce raiders. The commerce raiders had been built in British shipyards, so the U.S. government considered Britain partly responsible for the damage caused by the ships. Then there was the argument since the 1840s over who owned a group of islands between Vancouver Island and the state of Washington. The third argument, the U.S. and Canada had a long disagreement over fishing rights off both coasts of North America. Now, the United States and Britain settled all three issues with the Treaty of Washington, which set up international tribunals to deal with each question. One tribunal awarded the United States more than $15 million in damages from Britain for the destruction caused by the commerce raiders. Another tribunal awarded possession of the islands off Vancouver to the United States. And finally, the third required the U.S. to pay Canada more than $5 million for special fishing privileges. After the Treaty of Washington, there was greater friendship and cooperation between the U.S., Britain, and Canada. Okay, like I said in our last lesson, while the U.S. was focusing on its own domestic affairs, the Germans, Dutch, French, and British were establishing colonies around the world. As you can see, there's a reason why it was said that the sun never set on the British Empire. Their empire is in yellow, and it is all across the world. This was the result of imperialism. Now remember, imperialism is the process of building empires through more powerful nations gaining economic and political control over weaker nations, which usually become colonies. Now, the process of imperialism made the participating strong nations wealthy and powerful. Take a look at this cartoon by Thomas Nast. So, who are the three nations portrayed in this cartoon? Well, it's Britain, which is, you can see that in British. You've got Germany, and you've got Russia. Germany seems to be focused on Africa, and Russia seems to be focused on Asia. So, why do you think the figure representing Britain is holding a bag behind his back? Well, maybe Britain is waiting for the opportune moment to seize territory once Russia and Germany have made their claims. Or because Britain has already grabbed its desired territory and is holding the grab bag out of sight and out of reach. The bag does seem pretty full, right? Yeah, that thing is huge compared to the other two. Nast seems to be against imperialism in this cartoon. He uses the word plunderers in the title of the cartoon, which, see, plunderers, which isn't exactly the nicest term to use. The cartoon also portrays the European powers as greedy men trying to take all that they can get. Now, this scramble for colonial possessions that Americans were witnessing from their isolated seat in the Western Hemisphere caused some to desire a new seat at the imperial table, and others to raise their eyebrows in question. So let's look at some of the arguments from both sides, those that were for imperialism and those who were against it. Those that were for imperialism thought it enhanced a nation's prestige and pride, while at the same time increasing its power. But those who were against thought that instead of prestige, pride, and power, it was only reflecting social Darwinism, the whole survival of the fittest thing. Those that were for imperialism also thought that imperialism helped acquire natural resources that the United States needed. But those who were against imperialism pointed out that the U.S. had plenty of resources, and any resources they needed could easily be purchased. Those for imperialism thought that it would help spread Western civilization. Rudyard Kipling referred to it as the white man's burden, sharing the fruits of his culture to less civilized nations. But those against thought that it only led to exploitation and racism, because those who gave the aid often treated those receiving the aid as inferiors, sometimes on the basis of racial superiority. Often the mother country would send its own citizens to oversee the colony's industries, hire local workers for low wages, and send the profits back to the mother country. And finally, those for imperialism argued that it allowed for the spread of Christianity by opening countries to missionaries. Those against imperialism were frustrated at how many imperial governments interfered with mission work, especially if it didn't advance the imperialism doctrine. While the storm over imperialism was raging, a variety of circumstances allowed the U.S. to acquire foreign lands, especially in the Pacific region. The first acquisition was when the U.S. bought Alaska from Russia in 1867. Americans felt that Secretary of State William Seward had made a huge mistake, many calling Alaska, which was thought to be an empty wasteland of snow and ice, Seward's Folly or Seward's Icebox. But still, at the cost of only $7.2 million, less than 2 cents an acre, Alaska seemed to be a bargain, and the Senate passed the treaty with ease. It wouldn't take long for Alaska to prove a huge bargain. Huge! You see, gold was discovered in 1896. Then silver, copper, and oil were discovered. Not to mention, it was an amazing source of fishing. In fact, my brother in law is a commercial fisherman in Alaska. Eventually, Alaska would become the 49th state in 1959. Now, other territories acquired by the U.S. in the Pacific were the Midway Islands and Samoa. Now, understand, as the U.S. increased trade with Asia, they needed to find ports in the Pacific to refuel the merchant ships. In 1859, American sailors discovered and claimed some uninhabited islands about halfway between North America and Asia. That's why they're called the Midway Islands. The U.S. annexed Midway Island in 1867. Another set of islands that Americans were stopping at to refuel was the Samoa Islands. But it wasn't just the Americans that were using the Samoa Islands. Britain and Germany had their ships stopping there as well. So, in 1889, a joint protectorate of the Samoan Islands was created between America, Britain, and Germany. But then a disagreement broke out among the three nations, which led to the division of the islands between Germany and the U.S. in 1899. So, when it came to the annexation of the Midway Islands and Samoa, which of the reasons for imperialism, as found on page 367, are best reflected in the gaining of these territories? Well, these annexations definitely increased the power of the U.S. naval forces, and both increased trade. Another Pacific addition to the U.S. was Hawaii. For years, Hawaii had been an important supply point for whalers, merchant ships, and warships. Western civilization had definitely made its mark on the islands. In 1840, Christianity became the official religion of Hawaii, and shortly thereafter, Americans set up sugar plantations and created a thriving sugar industry that dominated the economy of Hawaii. In 1875, tariffs on sugar imported from Hawaii was eliminated, which was a huge benefit to the Hawaiian economy. And in 1887, the U.S. was granted the right to use Pearl Harbor as a naval base. But American businessmen began to get greedy. That same year, they forced the Hawaiian king to accept a new constitution, which limited his power and took voting rights away from most Hawaiians and immigrants from Asia, and gave voting rights to wealthy Americans and Europeans who weren't even Hawaiian citizens. Not long after, Queen Liliuokalani came to the throne. She tried to establish native control of the island and limited American power by revoking their voting rights. Yeah, that didn't go over very well. She was overthrown by American businessmen with the aid of the U.S. Marines. Now, one such American businessman was Sanford Dole, who led the new government and asked the U.S. to annex Hawaii. It would definitely help their sugar industry to be considered domestic instead of foreign. President Grover Cleveland wasn't in favor of annexation because he felt that Liliuokalani was overthrown illegally. Hawaii, therefore, existed for several years as an independent republic, with Sanford Dole as its president. Then, when the U.S. was at war in the Pacific with Spain, Pearl Harbor became a key supply station, and the U.S. was afraid that the Japanese would annex it first, which led Congress to vote to annex the islands. In 1959, Hawaii became the 50th state. So let me ask you, which reason against American imperialism is reflected in the quote from the first paragraph of Queen Liliuokalani's appeal to the American people, found on page 369? What biblical story did the queen allude to? What point did she make? Who were the fathers and sons that she mentioned? Take a moment and read the quote and answer the questions. So, what reason against American imperialism is reflected? American ideals like liberty and self government. She alluded to King Ahab's taking of Naboth's vineyard and Elisha's proclamation of God's judgment. She used the story to warn the American people against coveting and annexing Hawaii. And the fathers and sons were the missionaries who proclaimed the gospel to the native Hawaiians, and the sons of the missionaries who worked to overthrow the Hawaiian monarchy. Okay, so in today's lesson, we talked about how the new imperialist tendencies led to America's expansion in the Pacific. You can see on this map that we significantly dominated the middle of the Pacific Ocean, creating an empire that helped us with our trade with Asia. In our next lesson, we'll continue our discussion of the new imperialist tendencies, focusing in on foreign missions. See you then. Have an absolutely fantastic day.